Chapter 1 of D-99. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jerry Pyle. D-99 by H.B. Fyfe. Chapter 1. At the 99th floor, Westervelt left the public elevator for a private automatic one which he took 4 floors further. When he stepped out, the dark, lean youth faced an office entrance whose double transparent doors bore the discreet legend, Department 99. He crossed the hall and entered. Waving at the little blonde in the switchboard cubby to the right of the doorway, he continued a few steps into the office beyond. 2 secretaries looked up from the row of desks facing him, a third place being unoccupied. Behind them, long windows filtered the late afternoon light to a mellow tint. "Did you get it all right, Willie?" asked the dark girl to his left. "Mr. Smith wants you to take it right in. He expected you earlier." "My flight from London was late. I did the best I could after we landed," said Westervelt. "It took me the whole day to fetch this gadget. At least let me get my coat off." He moved to his right, to a modest desk in an alcove formed by the end of the office, and the high partition that enclosed the switchboard. "How do you find yourself inside that?" asked the other secretary, a golden-haired girl with a lazy smile. "Talk about women's clothes. The men are wearing topcoats like tents this year." Westervelt felt himself flushing, to his disgust. He struggled out of the coat, removed an oblong package and a large envelope from inner pockets, and tossed the coat on his desk. It had hardly settled before the door at the opposite end of the office, beyond the dark girl, was flung open. From the next room lumbered a man who looked even lankier than Westervelt, because he was an inch or two over 6 feet tall. His broad forehead was grooved by a scowl of concentration that brought heavy eyebrows nearly together over a high-bridged nose. His chin seemed longer for his chewing nervously upon his lower lip. He was in shirt sleeves and badly needed a haircut. "I'm going down to the comm room, Miss Diorio," he told the brunette. "There's another weird report coming in." He vanished into the hall with a clatter. His secretary looked at Westervelt, a smile tugging at the corners of her full lips. She threw up her hands with a little flip. "I told you to take it right in," she reminded him. "Oh, come on, Cy. What if I'd been in the doorway when he came through?" "What is it, anyway?" asked the other girl. Westervelt looked around as she rose. Beryl Austin, he thought, would be a knockout if only there were less of a hint of ice about her. She was, in her high heels, only an inch shorter than he. Her face was round, but with a delicate bone structure that lent it an odd beauty. Westervelt was privately of the opinion that she spoiled the effect by wearing her hair in a style too short and too precisely arranged, and too bleached, he told himself. The talk was that, before coming to the department, she had won 2 or 3 minor beauty contests. That might explain the meticulous makeup and the smart blue dress that followed the curves of her figure so flatteringly. Westervelt suspected, from hints dropped by Simonetta Diorio, that this was insufficient qualification for being a secretary, even in such a peculiar institution as Department 99. Of course, maybe Smith had ideas of making her a field agent. He held out the package in the palm of his hand. "They said at London Lab that it was a special flashlight that would pass for an ordinary one." "Oh, the one for the Antares case," exclaimed Beryl. "Cy was telling me how they'll send out plans of that. Did they show you how it works?" "It gives just a dim beam until you press an extra switch," said Westervelt. "Then it puts out a series of dashes bright enough to hurt your eyes." "What in the world do they want that for?" asked Beryl. "What in some other world, you mean? On some of these planets, the native life is so used to a dim red sun that a flash like this on their sensitive eyes can knock them unconscious." "This place is just full of dirty tricks like that," said the blonde. "Why can't they free these people some other way?" Westervelt and Simonetta looked at each other. Beryl had been in the department only a few weeks and did not yet seem to have heard the word. Or understand it, maybe, thought Westervelt. She might not look half so intelligent without that nice chest expansion. "Some of them just get in trouble," Simonetta was saying. "The laws of alien peoples we've been meeting around the galaxy don't necessarily make sense to Terrans. But why can't they stay away from such queer places?" "What would you do?" asked Westervelt. "If you were in a spaceship that blew up near a strange planetary system, and you took an emergency rocket to land on the best-looking planet, and the local BIMs arrested you because they have a law against anyone passing through their system without special permission." "But how can they make a law like that?" demanded Beryl. "Who says they can't? They had a war with beings from the star nearest them, and wound up suspicious of every kind of spaceship. We have a case like that now." "They've been working on it 2 months," Simonetta confirmed. "Those poor men were jailed over a month before anybody even heard about them." Beryl shrugged and turned back to her desk. Westervelt watched her walk, thinking that the rear elevation was good too, until it occurred to him that Simonetta might be taking in his expression. The blonde settled herself and leaned back to stretch. He was willing to bet 10 credits that she did it just to get his goat. Well, the work is interesting, Beryl admitted, but I don't see why it can't be done by the Department of Interstellar Relations. The DIR is trained diplomats and knows all about dealing with aliens. Come on now, dear, said Simonetta. Where do you think your paycheck originates? Publicly, the DIR doesn't like to admit that we exist. To hide the connection, they named us after the floor we're on in this building, and hoped that nobody would notice us. I knew I was getting into something crooked, exclaimed Beryl. It depends, said Westervelt. Suppose some Terran spacer is slung into jail out there somewhere for something that would never be a crime in the solar system. The DIR protests, and the BIM simply deny they have him. How far can diplomacy go? We tried getting him out some other way. He held up the flashlight. Now they'll Stellarfax plans of this out to Terra to our field agents. After one is made and smuggled into our case, all they have to do is run in a fast ship and pick him up when he breaks out. Speaking of that gadget, Simonetta suggested, why don't you take it down to Mr. Smith? He must be waiting out the message in the comm room. Westervelt agreed. He took the package and the envelope of blueprints and walked into the hall. He turned first to his right, along the base of the U-shaped corridor, then to his left after passing the door to the fire stairs at the inner corner, and the private entrance to Smith's office opposite it. The walls were covered by a gray plastic that was softly monotonous in the light of the luminous ceiling. The floor, nearly black, was of a springy composition that deadened the sound of footfalls. Along the wing of the U into which he turned, Westervelt passed doors to the department's reference library and to a conference room on his right, and portal marked shaft on his left. Beyond the latter was a section of blank wall behind which he knew was a special shaft for the power conduits that supplied the department's own communications instruments. The place was a self-sufficient unit, he reflected. It had its own TV equipment and a subspace radio for reaching far-out spaceships, although most routine traffic was boosted through relay stations on the outer planets of the solar system. Some lines of communication with the field agents were tenuous, but messages usually got through. If the lines broke down, someone would be sent to search the confidential files for a roundabout connection. I wonder how many of us would wind up in court if those files became public knowledge, thought Westervelt. I'd like to see them trying to handle Smitty. Nobody here can figure him out all the time, and we're at least half as nutty as he is. Down beside the communications room, though normally reached by the other wing of the corridor that enclosed the core of elevators, shafts, and restrooms, the department even had a confidential laboratory. Actually, this was more in the nature of a stockroom for peculiar gadgets and implements used for the fell purposes of the organization. Westervelt did not like to wander about in there for fear of setting something off. It was more or less the domain of the one man in the department whom he knew to have been in an alien prison. Robert Leidman was an ex-spacer who had joined the group after having been rescued from just such an incarceration as he now specialized in cracking. Westervelt had been told that the sojourn among the stars had left Leidman a trifle strange, which was probably why they no longer used him as a field agent. He came to the blank end of the corridor, the last door on the right being that of the communications room. He opened it and stuck his head inside. The room was dimmer than the corridor. The operators, who sometimes had to contend with much relayed faint images on their screens, liked it that way. They kept the window filters adjusted so that it might as well be night outside. Here and there, small lights glowed at various radio receivers or tape recording instruments, and there was a pervading background rustle of static blended with quiet whistles and mutterings. At the moment, the operator on duty was Charlie Colburn, a quiet redhead who kept a locker full of electronic gadgets for tinkering during slow periods. Smith sat near him in a straight-back chair, watching the screen before Colburn. A message was coming in from Pluto Relay. Westervelt recognized the distant operator who spoke briefly to Colburn before putting the message through. The next face, blurry from repeated boosting of the image, was that of a stranger. "This is Johnson, on Trident," the man said. "Capella 4 tells me they gave you the facts about Harris. That right?" Smith hitched himself closer so the transmitter lens could pick him up. Westervelt tiptoed inside and found himself a stool. "We just got the outline," Smith said. "You say this spacer is being held by the natives and they won't let you communicate with them. Have you reported to the DIR?" The distance and the relaying caused a few seconds of lag, even with the ultra-modern subspace equipment. "I am the DIR," said the face on the screen after a bitter pause, "along with several other jobs, commercial and official. There are only a few of us Terrans at this post, you know. The natives won't even admit they have him." Then how can you be sure they do? And why can't you get to him somehow? We know because he managed to get a message out. We think, Johnson frowned doubtfully. That is, he did if we can believe the, messenger. We made inquiries of the natives, but it is impossible to make much of an investigation because their civilization is an underwater one. Smith noticed Westervelt. Willie, he whispered hastily, get on the phone and have one of the girls stop in the library and fetch me the volume of the Galatlas with Trident in it. Westervelt dropped his package on a table and punched Barrel's number on the nearest phone. Meanwhile, with its weird pauses, the interstellar talk continued. The missing Terran, Harris by name, had insisted against all advice at the outpost on one of the watery planet's few islands, upon conducting submarine exploration in a converted space scout. Since 95% of the surface of Trident was ocean, Johnson had only a vague idea of where Harris had gone. The point was that the explorer had been too long out of touch. The natives, a sea people of crustacean evolution, who were to be found over most of the ocean bottom, and who had a considerable culture with permanent cities and jet-propelled submarine vehicles, admitted to having heard of Harris, but denied knowledge of his whereabouts. So we reported to the DIR sector headquarters, Johnson concluded. They sent an expert to coax the Tridentian officials into visiting the shallows for a conference, but nothing came of it. Then we called in one of your field agents and he referred us to you. Barrel entered the room, quietly, bearing a large book. Westervelt held out his hand for it, but she seemed not to see him until he rose to offer her the stool. When he turned his attention back to the screen, Smith was probing for information which the distant Johnson sounded reluctant to give. But if they deny everything, how do you know he's not dead instead of being held in one of their cities? Why do you think he's being made a sort of exhibit? Johnson hemmed and hawed, but finally confessed. Besides the crustaceans, who were about man-sized and civilized, there was another form of intelligent, or at least semi-intelligent life on Trident. Certain large, fish-like inhabitants of the planet's seas had been contacted more than once to deliver messages to the exploring members of the outpost. This was always promptly accomplished by having one of the fish contact another of the same species, who was in the right location. What did you say? Demanded Smith. Telepathic? A telepathic fish? Oh no, don't ask us to. Well, what I mean is, well, how do you know they're reliable? More in the same vein followed. Westervelt stopped listening when he realized that Smith was being convinced, willing or not. Stranger things were on record on the immensity of the known galaxy, but Smith took the attitude that they were all a plot against Department 99. Westervelt pried the book from Barrel's grasp and turned over pages to the article on the planet Trident. He skimmed the opening, which dealt with galactic coordinates and the type of the star at the center of the system. It did the same with the general description of the surface and what was known of the life forms there. A history since discovery was laconically brief. Here it is, he told himself. A species of life resembling a Terran fish in general configuration, about 20 feet in length and suspected of having some undetermined sense, whereby individuals can locate each other at great distances. Well, by the time it's in print, it's outdated. Someone turned on a bright light, and he realized the interstellar talk was at an end. Smith looked around. He held out his hand for the book, seeming to take for granted that someone should have found the page. I don't see how we're going to reach this one, he grunted, plopping the volume down on the table to scan the article. Colburn snatched at a small piece of apparatus he had evidently been assembling. Only Barrel was impressed. The others knew that Smith said this of every new case. Tell Mr. Leidman and Mr. Parrish I want a conference, the department head requested. We'll use the room next door. Barrel and Westervelt left Colburn examining his gadget suspiciously and retraced their steps up the corridor. At the door to the main office, the blonde left him, presumably to go through to the corner office occupied by Parrish, whose secretary she was. Westervelt dwelt on the thought of sending her on her way with a small pat, but forced himself to continue up the other wing of the U. He passed 2 doors on his left, another conference room, and a spare office used mainly for old files. Doors to his right led to washrooms. This end of the hall was not blank, as on the other side it had a door labeled Laboratory, No Admittance. The last door to the left, corresponding to the location of the communications room, led to Leidman's office. Westervelt knocked, waited for the sound of a voice inside, and walked in. For a moment he saw no one, then pivoted to his right as he remembered that Leidman kept his desk on the inner wall, around the short corner behind the door. Everyone else who had a corner office sat out by the windows. He found himself facing a heavy man, whose bleached crew cut and tanned features bespoke much time spent outdoors. Very beautiful eyes of a dark gray blue regarded him steadily, until Westervelt felt a panicky urge to run. Instead, he cleared his throat and gave Smith's message. Leidman always had the same effect on him for the first few minutes, although he seemed to like Westervelt better than anyone else in the office, even to the point of inviting him home for weekends of swimming. I always get the feeling that he looks right through me and back again, thought Westervelt, but I can't see an inch into him. End of Chapter 1. Of D-99. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Jerry Pyle. Chapter 2. Castor P. Smith sat at the head of his steel and plastic table in the conference room, whistling thoughtfully as he waited for his assistants. Next door, in the communications room, the tortured tune his lips emitted would have been treated as deliberate jamming. Simonetta Diario entered carrying a recorder, and he roused himself for a smile of appreciation. "You won't forget to turn it on when you start, Mr. Smith?" she pleaded. "I'll keep my finger on the switch until then," he grinned. "Thanks, Si." Left alone again, he told himself he would have to do something about the reputation he was acquiring, quite without foundation, he believed, for being absent-minded. After all, he was hardly likely to forget to record a conference when it was his own idea. So many ideas were tossed around on a good day that some were bound to be lost, unless they were down on tape. Even a good steno like Simonetta could not guarantee to keep up with it all when two or three got to talking at once. Generally, he admitted to himself, he erased the tape without the necessity of filing some brilliant solution. Still, the 1 in 1,000 that did turn up made the precaution worthwhile. He stared morosely at the volume of the Galatlas he had brought from the communications room. Sometimes, in this job, he lost his sense of galactic direction. Calls were likely to come in from stars of which he had never heard. Wish I could get a little more help from the DIR, he thought. It's more than having one secretary on vacation just now. We're always short-handed. They never brought us up to strength since old Murphy blew himself up in the lab with that little redhead. Maybe Willie will grow into something. That will take years, though. We ought to have some kind of training school. In Smith's opinion, he should have had a larger force of full-time agents in the field, but he recognized the difficulties inherent in the immensity of Terran-influenced space. Even recruiting was a hit-or-miss process. He had made various working arrangements out of chance contacts with independent spacers. He supposed that it was unofficially expected of him, and most had worked out well. About a dozen routine cases were currently being handled out there somewhere by a motley crew of his own men and piratical temporary help. In addition, there were 3 hot cases that had required supervision from headquarters. I wonder if we should stay a little late tonight, he asked himself. I hate to ask them again, but who knows what will break with this new skullcracker. He looked up as Pete Parrish entered. His dapper assistant walked around the other end of the table and took a seat on the window side. "I hear you have another one," he greeted Smith. Parrish was a trim man of 36 or 37, just about average in height, but slim enough to seem taller. Smith was aware that the other took considerable pains to maintain that slimness. By his own account, he rode well and played a fast game of squash. The wave in his dark hair was somewhat suppressed by careful grooming. He smiled frequently, or at least made a show of gleaming teeth, but at other times his neat, regular features were disciplined into a perfect mask. Thank God that he doesn't wear a mustache, thought Smith. That would put him over the brink. He was reasonably certain that Parrish had given the idea careful calculation and stopped just short of the brink. That would be typical of the man. He had been at one time a publicist, then a salesman, on Terra and in space. Actually, he should have been a confidence man. It was not until the department had stumbled across him that he had found opportunity to exercise his real talents. He was expert at estimating alien psychology and constructing rationalizations with which to thwart it. Smith realized self-consciously that he had been staring through Parrish. He passed one hand down the back of his neck, reminding himself that he must get a haircut. He could not imagine why he kept forgetting. It occurred to him every time he faced Parrish. He decided further to wear a freshly pressed suit the next day. Leidman padded in, glanced about the room, and sat down as near to the door as he could, without leaving an obvious gap between himself and the others. He eyed Parrish briefly and raised one hand to check the scarf at his throat. Leidman dressed unobtrusively and probably would have preferred an old-fashioned tie to the bright neck scarves favored by current fashion. I wonder why I'll get all the nuts, Smith asked himself, avoiding the beautiful eyes by looking squarely between them. Even the girls, people with romantic ideas of cloak and dagger work, or the ones that owe us favors, keep sending us peaches. Then they marry off or go around acting so secretive that they draw attention to us. Sometimes, he had to admit, he would have preferred having a babe marry and leave the department. Parrish was often helpful in such situations, which was only fair since he created most of them. Twice divorced, the assistant had lost none of his interest in women. He was as clever at feminine psychology as at alien. "Well, I suppose you've heard something of the new squawk," Smith said to break the silence. "I just don't see how we're going to reach this one. The damn fool got himself taken on an ocean bottom." He proceeded to outline the facts so far reported. Parrish received them impassively. Leidman began to scowl. The ex-spacer developed special grudges against aliens who attempted to conceal the detention of Terrans. "First, let's see where we are before we tackle this," suggested Smith. "I've given you enough on Harris to let it percolate through your minds while we review the other cases. It looks like something we should all be in on." Sometimes he would put a case in the charge of one of them, but they were accustomed to exchanging information and advice. "This business of the two spacers who were nailed for unauthorized entry into the Sokin system seems about ripe," he reminded them. "Taranto and Myers, you remember." "Oh yes," said Leidman, in a withdrawn tone. "The dope." "That's right. There was no trouble getting information about them, just in comprehending the idiot reasoning that would maintain a law that makes it a crime to crash land on that planet. Terra, like any other stellar government, has permitted one official resident there. Fortunately, we got the DIR to slip him a little memo about us before he was sent out, and this is the outcome. They may even be on the loose right now." "Let me see," mused Parrish. "Bob gave you the formula for something that practically suspends animation, didn't he?" "Yeah," said Leidman. "We figured on the bastards to carry the bodies out and dump them. A bunch of tramp spacers is standing by to pick them up." "No reason why it shouldn't work," said Smith. "Variations of it have been keeping us in business. Someday we'll slip up just by relying on it too much, but this looks okay. How is your Greenhaven case coming, Pete?" Parrish hesitated before answering. He stroked the edge of the table with well-manicured fingertips as he considered. "Maria Ringstag," he said thoughtfully. "These reporters should be more careful, should have some knowledge of the cultures they poke into. Greenhaven is hardly a colony to swash a buckle through. I suppose she never thought they would bother a newswoman. Did you ever get the answer to what she was after on Greenhaven?" "Nothing. Just passing through." Parrish snapped his fingers in contempt. "She was on a space liner, en route to Altair 7, to gather material for a book. It stopped on Greenhaven to deliver a consignment of laboratory instruments." "Those greenies," Leidman put in, "are as crazy as Bims. What a way to live." "They have been described as the bluest colony ever derived from Terra," agreed Smith. "I shudder to think of the life Pete would lead there." Parrish smiled, but not very deeply. "Miss Ringstad's mistake was fairly simple-minded," he said. "They had official prices posted in that shop she visited for souvenirs. When they claimed to be out of the article she fancied, she had the bad taste to offer a bonus price. On Greenhaven, this is regarded as bribery, immorality, and economic subversion, to touch merely upon the highlights." Smith sighed. "Why will these young girls run around doing—" "I don't believe you could call her a girl exactly," Parrish interrupted. "Well, this lady, then." "I wouldn't guarantee that either." Smith shrugged and pursed his lips. "You'd be a better judge than I," he admitted innocently. "I yield to superior qualifications." Leidman grinned. Parrish maintained his mask. "I suppose that might make it even more dangerous for her," Smith went on. "I forget what you said the sentence was, but suppose she starts to get smart in jail. Would any snappy Terran humor pass there?" "By no means," said Parrish emphatically. "I would not expect them to burn her at the stake in this day and age, but they would talk about it as being one of the good old ways. Fortunately, their speaking and writing Terran makes this easy. Terrans are all black centers, but plenty of Terrans are necessary around the spaceports. We keep a few agents among them. One of them is going to pull the paper trick to spring her." "I'd rather leave them a bomb," said Leidman almost to himself. Smith frequently wondered what such a rugged man should speak in so quiet a voice. At times, Leidman used a monotone that was barely audible. "We hope to destroy all evidence," added Parrish. "Otherwise, it will lead to the usual diplomatic notes, and the DIR will be telling us we never were authorized to do any such thing." "Yes," said Smith, nodding wearily. "Actually, you couldn't find our specific duties written down anywhere, and there is nothing we are forbidden to do either. As long as it succeeds, well, none of us will see the day when the DIR will publicly recognize us to the extent of chopping our heads into the basket. They have been yapping at me, though, for drawing complaints in the Gerson case." Leidman had been sitting with his gaze narrowed upon a pencil gripped in his big fists. Now he raised his head, sensing interference in his own project. "How can the Yolanites complain? They claim they don't even have Gerson." "Easy," Smith soothed him. We have an embassy in spaceport there, remember, that you've been relying on. You had them make some inquiries, didn't you? Had to confirm the report somehow. All we had was the story of a kidnapping from the captain of that freighter. It might not have been true. I realize that, said Smith. It would have been the first time a spacer got left behind because he didn't make countdown, or because they didn't want him around to pay off. Sure, Parrish agreed smoothly. You could tell us about that. Leidman turned to look at him, so suddenly that a silence fell among them. Parrish averted his gaze uncomfortably and reached into the breast pocket of his maroon jacket for a box of cigarettes. He busied himself puffing one alight from the chemical lighter set in the bottom of the box. One day I'll have to pull them apart, thought Smith, and I'm not big enough. Where does my wife get the nerve to say the neighbors don't know what to make of an average guy like me, just because I can't talk about my work? At any rate, he said quietly, they took the attitude that even to ask them about the incident was insulting. It seemed to rock the top brass. What do they know about Yolene? Growled Leidman, giving up his scrutiny of Parrish. Not a thing, probably. They make decisions on the basis of how many toes they stubbed lately. Right now it sounds like only routine panic. That reminds me, I meant to check with Emil Stark about that. He shoved back his chair and stepped over to a phone table nearby. Switching on both screen and sound, he waited until the cute little blonde at the board came on. Pauline, get me Emil Stark at the DIR, please. Extension 1563. Yes, Mr. Smith, said Pauline, and disappeared from the screen. In a few moments, Smith was greeting a man of about 50, gray at the temples to the point of appearing over-distinguished. Listen, Emil, he said, getting down to business after the amenities about families and children had been observed. I have a case on my hands concerning a planet named Yolene. The man on the screen was already nodding. Yes, I heard they were chewing you out about that this morning, he said, smiling. I trust you preserved some sort of sang-froid. What's in their minds? Asked Smith. Oh, it seems that the Space Force is nervous over the Yolenites. They are unable to evaluate the culture comfortably. To cover themselves, I imagine they send a warning now and then on the possibilities of hostile relations. Anything to it? Stark grimaced briefly. Unlikely. Some of the lads upstairs let it make them nervous. Smith chuckled. Upstairs. They came and went, but Stark and men like him ran things and knew what went on. Then I can go ahead without covering my tracks too deeply, he asked. I mean, I won't have to lie openly to my boss. Give him a few days to see the other side, Stark assured him, and he will be demanding to know why you have not taken steps. Have them taken by then. Smith thanked him for the advice, switched off, and returned to his place at the table. Nods from the others confirmed that they had heard. I have a feeling about those Yolenites, grumbled Leidman. Smith waited for elucidation, but the big man had sunk into contemplation. The other two eyed him, then each other. Parrish shrugged ever so slightly. Smith gnawed at his lower lip. Well then, you'll be going ahead with what you planned, he reminded Leidman. Oh sure, answered the ex-spaceman, snapping out of it. Can't help it. I've already sent him something useful. The others smiled. Something useful was Leidman's term for a cleverly designed breakout instrument. Smith hoped that in this case it would not turn out to be a bomb. We dug a little mechanical crawler out of the files, Leidman went on. The Yolenites seemed to build their cities like a conglomeration of pueblos, very intricate, and with hardly any open streets. There would probably be 100 routes into Gerson, even if we knew exactly where he is. The gadget is adjusted to home on certain body temperatures, which it can detect at some distance. And Gerson would be the only living thing there at 98.6. Exactly. Of course, the thing has a general direction and search pattern microtaped in. That's the best they could do, because the boys have only a rough idea of where the cell would be. It sounds too easy to intercept, objected Parrish. That worries me a little, admitted Leidman. It would be worse to fly something in, and it's impossible to send anyone in because they say they haven't got him. The gadget is set to have an affinity for dark corners at least. And how does it get him out? Pursued Parrish. It carries a little pocket music player with microtapes that will actually play for a couple of hours. They can't tell for sure that Gerson didn't have it with him, if they spot it at all. When he opens the back, as a little jingle in the first tune will instruct him to do. He has a miniature torch hot enough to cut the guts out of any lock between him and the outside. Someone will be watching for him, I suppose, asked Smith. Sure, once he's out of the place. The Yolenites can hardly demand that we give back what they say they never had. Off to the embassy with him and on to the first ship. And I hope he kills a few of the bastards on the way out. They won't even have grounds for an official complaint. The other two avoided looking at him for a moment. Parrish stirred uneasily. I hope it... What I mean is, these Yolenites give me an uneasy feeling the same as they do you, Bob. Experience tells me that some of those hive-like cultures think along peculiar lines. No wonder the Space Force finds them hard to understand. I recommend that we open a general file on them. It might be just as well, Smith agreed, considering. They may give us more business in the future. He pushed back his chair and rose. Let's take a break while I see if any reports have come in. Then maybe we can work out something on the new mess. End of Chapter 2. D-99 by H.B. Fyfe, Chapter 3. This LibriVox recording is in public domain. Louis Taranto sat on his heels against the baked clay wall of the cell, watching the sweat run down the face of his companion. Though he privately considered Harvey Myers a very weak link, he had so far restrained himself from hinting as much. They were in this hole together, and he might well need the blubbery loudmouth's help to get out, if there were any way to get out. Myers sat on the single bench with which their jailers had provided them, staring mournfully at the rude table upon which he rested his elbows. He was unusually quiet, as if the heat had drained him of all anxiety. Sloppy bum, thought Taranto. He could at least comb his hair. They were allowed occasional access to toilet articles, which the Sosokins had obtained from the one Terran officially in residence on the planet. Taranto had shaved the day before, but the other had not bothered for more than a week. Myers was perhaps an inch short of 6 feet and must weigh 200 pounds Terran. He had a loose mouth between pudgy cheeks. His little blue eyes seemed always to be prying, except during periods such as the present, when he was feeling sorry for himself. He had been a medic in the same spaceship in which Taranto had been a ventilation mechanic. "Glad I was never sick," Taranto muttered to himself. Myers looked up. "Huh?" "I said I'm glad I was never sick," repeated Taranto deliberately, thinking let him figure that out if he can. "This heat's enough to make anybody sick," complained Myers. "Why do they have to keep us up on the top floor of the tower anyway? What kind of jail were you ever in where their prisoners got the best?" "Who says I was ever in jail?" demanded Myers defensively. Taranto grinned slightly but made no reply. After a moment the other returned to his study of the table. He breathed in loudly, his shoulders heaving as if he had been running. To avoid the sight, Taranto let his eyes wander for the 1000th time around the walls of the square cell. The large blocks of baked clay were turning from dun to gray in the twilight seeping through the 4 small window openings. Overhead, they curved together to form a high arch that was the peak of the tower. Besides table and bench, the room contained a clay water jug, a yard high, a wooden bucket, a battered copper cooking pot, and a pile of coarse straw upon which lay the 2 gray shirts the spacers had discarded in the heat. In the center of the floor was a wooden trapdoor which Taranto eyed speculatively. He reminded himself that he must suppress his longing to smash the next Sokin head that appeared in the opening. "It's getting near time," he remarked after a few minutes. Myers peered at the patches of sky revealed by the windows. They were losing the glare of Sokin daylight. There had been a wisp or two of cloud earlier, but these had either blown over or faded into the deepening gray of the sky. "Listen at the door," ordered Taranto, impatient at having to remind the other. He rose, wiped perspiration from his face with the palms of both hands, and rubbed them in turn on the thighs of his gray pants. He was inches shorter than Myers, and 20 pounds or more lighter, but his bare shoulders bulged powerfully. A little fat softened the lines of his belly without concealing the existence of an underlying layer of solid muscle. He moved with a heavy padding gait, like a large carnivore whose natural grace is revealed only at top speed. Myers watched him resentfully. Why couldn't I have made it to one of the other emergency rockets, he asked himself. Imagine a bunch of crazy savages that say even landing here is a crime. He supposed that Taranto would have pointed to the sizable city where they were held if he had heard the Sosokins called savages. Myers thought the trouble with Taranto was that he was too physical, too much of a dumb flunky who spoiled Myers' efforts to talk them out of trouble. I had a better break coming, he thought. He wished he had been in a rocket with one of the ship's officers who might have known about Sosoka. They would have gone into an orbit about the planet star and put out a call for help to the nearest Terran base or ship. As it was, they might be given up for lost even if the other rockets were picked up. The course they had been on before the explosion had been designed to pass the system by a good margin. Taranto, he recalled, had thought them lucky to have picked up the planet on the little escape ship's instruments. Taranto, decided Myers, thought he was a hot pilot because he had been a few years in space. He had not looked so good bending the rocket across that ridge of rock out in the desert. They should have taken a chance on coming down in the city here. They had just about straightened themselves out after that landing when they had seen the party of Sosokins on the way. It had not taken them long to reach the wreck. They could even speak Terran, and no Pigeon Terran either. Then it turned out they did not like spacers of any race landing without permission. There had been a war with the next star system, and the laws now said there should be only one alien of any race permitted to reside in Sosoka except for brief visits by licensed spaceships. "What's the matter with our government?" muttered Myers. "What?" asked Taranto, turning from one of the windows. "I said, what's the matter with the Terran government? Why don't they pitch a couple of bombs down here and show these skinny nuts who's running the galaxy? Who are they to call us aliens?" Taranto turned again to the 18-inch square window, set like the other three in the center of its walls at the level of his shoulders. "They're posting their sentries on the city wall for the night," he told Myers. "The thing should be flying in here any time now." "If it comes," said Myers grumpily. "Something will go wrong with that, too." The others spat out the window that faced the main part of the Sokin city, then padded to the one opposite. Strange patterns of stars gleamed already in the sky over the desert. The air that blew against his damp face was a trifle cooler. Should I tell the slop about that, he wondered? Nah, he'd try to breathe it all. Let him sweat, as long as he listens for the Sokins. Myers had left his bench to crouch over the trapdoor. There was no reason to expect their jailers, but the Sokins had a habit of popping up at odd times. The evening meal was usually brought well after dark, however. "Do you think it will really get here again?" asked Myers. "What if they spot it?" Taranto grunted. He was watching something he thought was one of the flying insects that thickened the Sokin twilight. Seconds later, he ducked away from the window as a pencil-sized thing with two pairs of flailing wings darted through the opening. It whirled about the dim cell. Myers flapped his hands about his head. The third time around, the insect passed within Taranto's reach, and he batted it out of the air with a feline sweep of his left hand. It fell against the base of the wall and twitched for a few minutes. Myers squinted at him, examining the slightly flattened nose and the meaty cheeks that gave Taranto a deceptively plump look. "You're quick, all right," he admitted. "They used to say in the ship that you were a boxer. What made you a spacer?" "Too short," said Taranto laconically. 5'8", and I grew into a light heavy." "What did that have to do with it?" "I did all right for a while. When I could get in on them, they'd go down and stay down. Then they learned to stick and run on me. It was either grow a longer arm or quit." "Maybe you should have quit sooner," said Myers, for no good reason except that he resented Taranto and blamed him for their predicament. "Why should I?" asked Taranto with a cold stare. "It was good money. Even after having my eyebrows fixed, I got a nice nest egg back on Terra. Nothing really shows on me except the habit of a short haircut." Myers ran his fingers through his own unkempt hair. "What was that for?" he asked. "Oh, it don't wave in the air so much when you stop a jab. Looks better to the judges." Myers grunted. He'd like to believe it doesn't show on him, he thought. Suddenly, he bent down to place an ear against the trap door. A petulant grimace twisted his features. "They're on the ladder," he whispered. "Wouldn't you know?" He straightened up and walked softly back to his bench. Taranto remained at the window. It was a perfectly natural place for him to be, he decided. A few moments later, the trapdoor creaked up, letting yellow light burst into the cell. It came from a clumsy electric lantern in the grip of the first Sokin who climbed into the chamber. Two others followed, suggestively fingering pistols that would have been considered crude on Terra 2 centuries earlier. The individual with the light was typical of his race, a tall, cadaverous humanoid with pale greenish-gray skin made up of tiny scales. His nose was flatter than that of a Terran ape, and his chin consisted mostly of a hanging fold of scaly skin. His ears were set very low on a narrow, pointed skull. Occasionally they made small motions as if to fold in upon themselves. The Sokins were clad in garments not unlike loose, sleeveless pajamas, over which they wore a leather harness for their weapons. The leader's suit was red, but the other two wore a dull brown. "Is all satisfactory?" asked the one in charge, staring about the cell with large black eyes. "All right," said Taranto stonily. He thought that a Sokin would never have answered that way. They were vain of their extraordinary linguistic ability and commonly spoke 3 or 4 alien tongues. Only an unfortunate inability to control excessive sibilance marred their Terran. Taranto felt like wiping his face, but realized that it was only sweat. The Sokin prowled around the room, examining each of the simple furnishings with a flickering glance. He took note of the food left in the copper pot. He checked the level of water in the big jar. He found the dead insect, which he sniffed and slipped into a pouch at his belt. Then he passed Taranto. The latter eyed him in measuring fashion. The Sokin halted out of reach. "You have been warned to obey all orders here," he said, staring between the two Terrans. "What's the trouble now?" demanded Myers, when it became apparent that the poker-faced Taranto intended to say nothing. "There was a question by the Terran we allow on the world. How can he know of your complaints? He was told only of your sentence." "We told you there would be protests from our government," said Myers. "All we did was land on your planet in an emergency. We're only too willing to leave. You have no right to keep us locked up in these conditions." "It is a violation of our law," said the Sokin imperturbably. "You go automatically to jail. We permit only one of every sky people to live here. Who could tell yours that you complain of this place? Listen, you better be careful of us Terrans, blustered Myers. We have ways. Shut up, said Taranto without raising his voice. He had inched forward, but stopped now as the two guards of the trapdoor gave him their attention. The Sokin with the lantern also turned to him. Taranto looked over the latter's shoulder. The window was black. The twilight of Soka was brief. Myers had flushed and was scowling at him with outthrust lower lip, but Taranto's icy order had spilled the wind from his sails. Perhaps you have had too much water, suggested the Sokin, regarding Taranto with interest. You have done something. It is best to tell me. Taranto returned the stare. He wondered why all the Sosokins he had seen, though rather fragile in build, were relatively thick-waisted. They looked to him as if a couple of solid hooks to the body would find a soft target. It was unlikely that the Sokin could read the facial expression of an alien Terran. It was probably some tenseness in Taranto's stance that caused the native to step back. The Terran strained his ears to pick up any unusual noise outside the window during the pause. He heard nothing except the whir of night insects. Their jailer paced once more around the cell, and Taranto cursed himself for arousing suspicion. Perhaps he hoped it was only annoyance. But what could I do, he asked himself. Let Myers spill it? In the end, with Taranto answering in monosyllables and Myers intimidated into an unnatural reserve, the Sosokins retired. The darkness closed in upon the Terrans as they listened to the creaking of the ladder below the trapdoor. Give them time, advised Taranto, hearing Myers move toward the exit. They waited in the silent dark until Myers could stand it no longer. They won't come back, he whispered. We'll make sure, said Taranto shortly. Get your ear to the wood. He felt his way to the window that faced away from the city. After the heat of the day, the air blowing in was almost cold, and he considered putting on his shirt. The realization that he would have to scrabble around the pile of straw for it gave him pause. His next thought was that he might come up with the wrong shirt, and that discouraged him completely. It was nearly half an hour later when he suspected Myers of dozing on the trap door, that Taranto heard something more than an insect zip past the window. He backed away and hissed to attract Myers' attention. Did it come? Whispered the other. I think so, answered Taranto. A tiny hum drifted through the window. Into the opening timidly edged a small hovering shape. Okay, said Taranto in a low voice, even though he knew the room was being scanned by an infrared detector. The shape blossomed out with a midget light. Enough of the glow was reflected from the adobe walls to reveal that a miniature flying mechanism the size of a man's hand had landed on the window ledge. After a moment, its rotors ceased their whirring. Taranto jabbed backward with an elbow as he heard Myers creep up behind him. Listen at the door, damn it, he snarled. All we need is to get caught at this, and we'll be here till they turn out the sun. Taranto, piped a tiny voice from the machine. Are you ready, Taranto? Go ahead. 2 pills coming out of the hold. The voice was clear enough in the stillness of the Sokin night. A hatch in the belly of the little flyer slid back. 2 capsules spilled out on the window ledge. Taranto scooped them up. You each take one with water, instructed the voice. Better wait till just before dawn. You told me they bring your food an hour later. That's right, whispered Taranto. That will give this stuff time to act. For all they can tell, you will both be deader than a burned-out meteorite. Then what? So they will follow their normal custom with the dead. Take you out to the desert to mummify. This thing will hover overhead to spot the location. Did they just leave us? Yes, as far as anybody has ever been able to find out. I talked to the Capellan next door in the foreign quarter here, and he says they might not leave you in one of their own burial grounds. Otherwise, I would hate to take the chance of having this gadget seen in the daylight. All right, so we're out in the desert, said Taranto. How does this ship you arranged for pick us up? We'll still be out for the count. I plan to tell them where to touch down. I can talk louder by radio, you know, than I can to you now. They will grab your bodies and scramble for space. Against the sunset, they may not even be seen from the city. If they are, I never heard of them. Who are they? Asked Taranto. Some bunch hired for the job by the DIR's Department 99. Just as well not to ask where they came from or what their usual line is. I ain't got any questions at all, if they get us out of here, said Taranto. He watched as the hatch closed itself and the tiny light blinked out. The rotors began to spin, and 2 minutes later they were alone. Come and get yours, said the spacer. He reached out with his empty hand to guide Myers to him, then very carefully delivered one of the capsules to the other. We're supposed to swallow that big lump? Whispered Myers. Just don't lose it, admonished Taranto. He relayed the instructions as precisely as he could. One thing more, he concluded. You stay awake to make sure I stay awake until it's time to take the stuff. We could take watches, suggested Myers. I could, said Taranto bluntly. But I'm not sure about you. In the second place, I ain't going to have you sleep while I don't. We're going to play this as safe as possible. Myers grumbled something inaudibly. In the darkness, a sardonic smile twisted Taranto's lips. If you know how, he advised, pray. We're going to our funeral in the morning. End of Chapter 3. D-99 by H.B. Fyfe, Chapter 4. This LibriVox recording is in public domain. Westervelt sat at his little desk in the corner, doodling out possible ways and means of breaking out of his cell 30 fathoms or so underwater. From time to time, Beryl or Simonetta offered a suggestion. He knew that everyone in the office was probably engaged in the same puzzle. Smith believed in general brainstorming and getting a project started, since no one could tell where a good idea might not originate. If I ever get into space, Willie muttered, it will never be to a planet as wet as Trident. Whatever made this heiress think he was a pearl diver? Is that what he was after? Asked Beryl. No, I just made that up. He glanced over at Simonetta, who winked and continued with a letter she was transcribing. An earphone reproduced Smith's dictation from his tape. As she listened, she edited mentally and spoke into the microphone of her typing machine, which transcribed her words as type. Westervelt realized that it was more difficult than it seemed to do the job so smoothly. He had noticed Beryl rewriting letters 2 or 3 times, and Parrish was more likely than the boss to set down his thoughts in a logical order. I've heard so many wild ideas in this office, said Beryl, that I simply don't know where to start. How do they decide on a good way? They guess, just the way we've been doing. They're better guessers than we are, from experience. It's just a matter of judgment, I suppose, Beryl admitted. They make their share of mistakes, Simonetta put in. Yeah, I read an old report on a great one, said Westervelt. Ever hear of the time they were shipping oxygen tanks to 3 spacers jailed out around Mazar? Simonetta stopped talking her letter, and the girls gave Willie their attention. It seems, he continued, that an exploring ship landed on a planet of that star and found a kind of civilization they hadn't bargained for. The natives breed the air with a high chlorine content, so when they grabbed 3 of the crew for hostages, the ship had to keep supplying fresh tanks of oxygen. How long could they keep that up? Asked Beryl. Not indefinitely, anyway. They weren't recovering any carbon dioxide for processing, the way they would in the ship. The captain figured he'd better lift and orbit while he tried to negotiate. Meanwhile, he sent to the department for help, and they came up with a poor guess. What? They got the captain to disguise some spacesuit rockets as oxygen tanks and send them down by the auxiliary rocket they were using to make deliveries and keep contact. The idea was that the prisoners would fly themselves over the walls like angels, the rocket would snatch them up, and they'd all filter the green-white light of Mazar from their lenses forever. And why didn't it work? Oh, it worked, said Westervelt. It worked beautifully. The only trouble was that when they got these 3 guys aboard and were picking up stellar speed, they found that the Mazarians had pulled a sleight of hand. They'd stuck 3 of their own into the Terran spacesuits, pretty cramped but able to move, and sent them to spy out the ship. Well, the captain took one look and realized it was all over. He couldn't supply the Mazarians with enough chlorine to keep them alive until they could be sent back. He just kept going. But the men they left behind, exclaimed Beryl. What happened to them? Westervelt shrugged. They never exactly found out. Beryl, horrified, turned to Simonetta, who stared reflectively at the wall. For all we know, said the dark girl, they were dead already. It was about even, said Westervelt. The Mazarians never heard exactly what happened to theirs either. There was a period of silence while they considered that angle. Simonetta finally said, Why don't you tell her about the time they gave that spacer the hormone treatment for a disguise? Oh, you tell it, said Westervelt, trapped. You know it better than I do. That one, began Simonetta, happened on a world where there's a colony from Terra that isn't much talked about. It's a sort of Amazon culture, and they don't allow men. They were set to execute this fellow who smuggled himself in for a lark. When the department started shipping him drugs that changed his appearance. Westervelt admired Beryl's wide-eyed intentness. Finally, Simonetta continued, his appearance changed so much that he could dress up and pass for a woman anywhere. He just walked out when the next scheduled spaceship landed, and was halfway back to Terra before they finished searching the woods for him. It made trouble, though. What happened? Breathed Beryl. They never quite succeeded in changing him back. His wife wound up divorcing him for infidelity when he gave birth to twins. Beryl straightened up abruptly. Oh, you come on now. Westervelt reminded himself that the blush must have resulted less from the joke than from having been taken in. They were still laughing when a buzzer sounded at Beryl's desk phone. She flipped the switch, listened for a moment, then rose with a toss of her blonde head at Westervelt. Mr. Parrish wants me to help him research in the dead files, she said. I bet he won't try that kind of gag on me. No, muttered Westervelt as she strode out. He has some all his own. He looked up to find Simonetta watching him with a grin. She shook her head ruefully as Westervelt grew a flush to match Beryl's. Willie, she said sadly, you aren't letting that bottle blonde bother you. I didn't think you were that kind of boy. Westervelt grinned back at some cost. Is there another kind? He asked. After all, she's only been around a few weeks. It's the novelty. I'll get used to her. Sure you will, said Simonetta. She returned to her letters and Westervelt hunched over his desk to brood. He wondered what Parrish and Beryl were up to in the file room. He could think of no innocent reason to wander in on business of his own. Perhaps, he reflected, he did not really want to. He might overhear something he would regret. He passed some time without directing a single thought to the problems of the department. Then the door beyond Simonetta opened, and Smith strolled out. He carried a pad as if he too had been doodling. Well, Willie, he said cheerfully, what are we going to do about this Harris fellow? All I can think of, Mr. Smith, is to offer to trade them a few people we could do without, said Westervelt. Smith grinned. He seemed to be willing to make up a little list. Some who never would be missed, eh? And let's head the page with people who take messages from thinking fish. He pottered about for a few moments before winding up seated on a corner of the unoccupied secretarial desk. I was actually thinking of skin divers, he confided. Then I realized that if it takes a 20-foot monster to wander the undersea wilds of Trident without being intimidated, maybe those waters wouldn't be too safe for a Terran swimmer. Unless I could get one of the monsters for a guide, suggested Westervelt. The three of them pondered that possibility. I can see it now, said Simonetta. My name's Swishy. Me good guide. You want find pearl? Not allowed here. We no steal from other fish. They laughed, and Smith demanded to know how one thought in pigeon talk. They discussed the probability of fraud in the reports that Smith had received, and concluded reluctantly that, whether or not some trick might be involved, there was bound to be some truth in the story. I suppose we'll have to use this fishy network to locate him, sighed Smith at last. It would take too long to ship out parts of a small sub to be assembled on Trident. The whole thing makes me wonder if I'll ever eat another seafood dinner. Maybe somebody else will think of something, said Westervelt, partly to conceal the fact that he himself had come up with nothing. Tell you what, said Smith, nodding. Suppose you go along and see how Bob Leibman is making out, while I sign these letters. You might check at the comm room sometime, too, in case anything else on the case comes in. Westervelt agreed, made sure he had something in his pocket to ride upon should the need arise, and left. A few minutes later he reached the end of the corridor, having cocked an ear at the door of the old file office as he passed, and heard Beryl giggling at some remark by Parrish. He unclenched his teeth and knocked on Leidman's door. He waited a minute and tried again, but there was still no answer. He hesitated, wondering what would happen should he walk in and find that Leidman was physically present, but not in a mood to recognize anyone else's existence. Slowly, he walked back to the washroom on the opposite side of the hall. Washing his hands with deliberation, Westervelt decided that it might be best to get Leidman on the phone. He could not, in fact, understand why inside phone calls were not more popular in the office. He supposed that the face-to-face habit had grown up among the staff, probably reflecting Smith's preference for getting everyone personally involved in everything. There might even be a deeper cause. They were so often in contact with distant places by the tenuous beaming of interstellar signals that there must be a certain reassurance and a sense of security in having within physical reach the person to whom one was speaking. I'll have to watch for that if I stay here long enough, Westervelt told himself. You don't have to be a prize fighter to get punchy, I guess. He examined himself critically in the mirror over the sink, thinking that he could do with a neater appearance. A coin in the slot of a dispenser on the wall bought him a disposable paper comb with which he smoothed down his dark hair. I need a haircut almost as bad as Castor P, he thought. I wonder if that really stands for Pollux. What a thing for parents to do. On the other hand, from people that came up with one like him, you'd expect almost anything. No one came in while he was in the washroom, much as he would have welcomed an excuse for conversation. He dawdled his way through the door into the corridor, not liking the thought of inflicting his presence upon Beryl and Parrish. That meant he would have to walk back as far as the spare conference room to find a phone. Of course, there's the lab, he muttered. That was only a few steps away, and he could hardly do much damage between the door and the phone. Reaching the end of the corridor once more, he decided to make one last try at Leidman's door. Again there was no reply to his knock, so he turned away to the laboratory door and entered. He was faced by a vista of tables, workbenches with power tools, and diverse assemblies of testing apparatus, most of the latter dusty and presenting the appearance of Goldbergs, knocked together for temporary use, and then shoved aside until someone might need a part from one of them. By far the greater space, however, was occupied by shelves and crates and stacks of small cartons, or loosely wrapped packages in which various gadgets seemed to be stored, after plans of them had been transmitted to the field. Half a dozen large files for drawings and blueprints reached nearly to the ceiling. Racks of instruments in relatively recent use or consideration stood here and there among the tables and workbenches. To Westervelt's right, near the far wall behind which lay the communications room, he caught sight of a prowling figure. He recognized Leidman's broad shoulders and hesitated. The ex-spacer had paused to examine a gadget lying on one of the tables. From Westervelt's position, it appeared to be a wristwatch, or something similar. Leidman picked it up and turned toward a part of the wall where a thick steel plate had been fastened to an insulated partition of brick. He raised the watch to eye level, as if aiming. A thin pencil of white flame leaped from the instrument to spatter sparks against the already scarred and stained steel. Sucked up by the air conditioning, the small puff of smoke disappeared so quickly that Westervelt realized that the scorched odor was entirely in his imagination. Leidman replaced the instrument casually before strolling over to another table. He inspected an open pack of cigarettes with a grim smile, but let them lie there in plain sight. Westervelt reminded himself never to grub one of those, just on general principles. Leidman went on to a small cylinder, somewhat larger than an old-fashioned battery flashlight. Something clicked under his finger, and from one end of the cylinder emerged the folding blades of a portable fan. The ex-spacer pressed a second switch position to start them spinning. He turned the fan to blow across his face as if to check its cooling power, then held the thing at arm's length as he thumbed the switch to a third position. A low humming sound reached Westervelt. It rose rapidly in pitch until it passed beyond his hearing range. He shook his head slightly. For some reason, he found it difficult to concentrate. Perhaps Leidman's presence, unexpected as it was, had upset him, he thought. He decided that he must be getting a dizzy spell of some sort. Then he became concerned lest he turn nauseous. The final stage, hardly a minute after Leidman had last moved the switch, found Westervelt tensing as a wave of sheer panic swept over him. He stepped back toward the door, noticing dizzily that Leidman wore a strange expression too. Part of the youth's mind wondered if some of the ultrasonic effect were reflected from the walls to the ex-spacer. Another part insisted upon leaving the scene as hastily as possible. He got himself into the corridor again, actually panting as he eased the door closed behind him. He started to walk, finding his knees a trifle loose. Passing the washroom, he hesitated, but he decided that he could make it to the conference room. Once there, however, he slipped inside and sat down to recover. What does it take to have a mind like that? He whispered to himself. It's like a hobby to him. I think someday I ought to look for a job with reasonably normal people. A few minutes of peace and quiet refreshed him. He returned to the main office just as Smith was surrendering a stack of signed letters to Simonetta Diorio. They looked around as he entered. Well, Willie, did he have anything going? Asked Smith. He was kind of busy, said Westervelt. What did he seem to have in mind? Smith started to reach for Simonetta's phone switch. I didn't ask him. He was busy in the lab. Oh, said Smith. He peered at Westervelt's expression and added, Then perhaps we'd better not disturb him. It might spoil any ideas he's putting together. Westervelt managed a grunt of assent as he turned to walk back to his desk. Whatever he's putting together, he thought. I'd rather stay out of the way. He hunched over his desk, staring unseeingly at the notes he had scribbled earlier. He was vaguely conscious of the succession of talk in the background, but he did not notice Simonetta's approach until the girl stood beside him. What happened, Willie? She asked. You look as if he threw you out. No, not deliberately anyhow, said Westervelt. At least, I don't think he knew I was even there. Although how can you tell if he doesn't want to let on? He told her what had happened in the laboratory. She nodded thoughtfully. I suppose it has its uses, said Westervelt. I hate to think of the way he plays around with things in there. Wasn't there a time when someone killed himself in that lab? That was years ago, said Simonetta. She hugged herself as if feeling a sudden chill, her large soft eyes serious. Westervelt realized that she was actually a very beautiful girl, much more so than Beryl, and he wondered why he felt so differently about them. Simonetta seemed too nice to fit the ideas he got concerning Beryl. Something told him that his thinking was mixed up. I guess you just grow out of that, he reflected silently. Maybe they're the same under the skin. End of chapter 4. D-99 by H.B. Fyfe, Chapter 5. This LibriVox recording is in public domain. When Beryl walked in, Westervelt was at one of the tall windows with Simonetta, dialing filter combinations to make the most of the setting sun. They had the edge of it showing as a deep crimson ball beside another building in the vicinity. What are you two doping out? Asked the blonde. Some disappearing trick? Simonetta laughed as Westervelt shoved the dial setting to afternoon normal. It's an idea, he said, scowling at Beryl. For underwater? She demanded mockingly. Ever hear of a squid? Retorted Westervelt. They hide themselves underwater. Maybe a cloud of dye would be as good as a filter. Willie, that is an idea, said Simonetta. You ought to tell Mr. Smith. Westervelt looked at her sourly. Now Beryl knew that they'd really been wasting time, and had a point to score against him in their next exchange. Oh well, I can't hold a thing like that against Cy, he thought. I can think of people who'd be on the way to Smitty already, calling it their own idea. Beryl had done a ladylike collapse into her chair and crossed her legs. She dug into her purse for cigarettes and requested a light. Why don't you buy a brand with a lighter in the box? Asked Westervelt. Nevertheless, he walked over to the switchboard cubicle for the office desk lighter that had been appropriated by Pauline. Returning with it after a moment, he lit Beryl's cigarette and inquired, "Well, what did you and Parrish dig up?" "I don't know," she sighed, leaning back. "But boy, did we dig." "Yeah, I thought I heard the shovel clink once," said Westervelt, thinking of the laughter he had heard through the door of the dead file office. Beryl, concerned with her own complaints, ignored him. "We must have looked up 30 or 40 cases," she went on. "I never even heard of most of those places on the newscasts." "Did he find anything that gave him an idea?" asked Simonetta. "Not a thing. There seemed to be some real crazy spots in the records, but nobody ever got in jail at the bottom of an ocean." "You'd think it would have happened sometime," said Simonetta thoughtfully. "I suppose," suggested Westervelt, "that on any planet where Terrans were taken underwater, they didn't live long enough to be one of our cases. On a place like Trident, they usually wouldn't have any trouble. They'd stay on land, and any local life would stay on the sea. It took a nut like Harris to go poking around where he wasn't wanted." "That's what Mr. Parrish hinted," said Beryl. "All I know is that it sounds like a story out of a laughing academy. They shouldn't allow them to get into places like that." "Then we'd all be looking for work," said Westervelt. "Don't complain, Beryl. Maybe it will happen to you someday." The blonde shivered and turned to face her desk. "Not me," she declared. "I'm staying on Terra, even if they do offer me a field trip as a sort of vacation." "Ah, he's already started that line on her," thought Westervelt. "I wonder if there's anything in the files on how to spring a secretary from a penthouse." Leidman and Parrish walked in, the latter pausing to exchange remarks with Pauline, the switchboard operator. A moment later, Smith opened his door as if expecting someone. He must have phoned them for a change, Westervelt realized. "Oh, there you are, Willie," said the chief. "I suppose you might as well sit in on this, too. We might need something, and meanwhile, you can be picking up a tip or two." Westervelt rose and followed the others into Smith's office, where he took a chair by the window. The others clustered around the chief's desk, a vast plateau of silvery plastic strewn with a hodgepodge of paper and tapes. The office itself was like a small museum. The walls were lined with photographs, mostly of poor quality, but showing interesting devices that had been used in various department cases. The ones in which the color was better usually showed Smith in company with 2 or 3 men wearing space uniforms and self-conscious looks. Sometimes a more assured individual was shown in the act of presenting some sort of memento or letter of appreciation to Smith. Leidman and Parrish also appeared in several of the pictures. The record of our best cases, thought Westervelt. The bad ones are buried in the files. Standing along the walls, or on little tables and bases of their own, were a good many models of spaceships, planetary systems, and non-humanoid beings. A few of the latter statues were enough to have made Beryl declare she was perfectly happy to stay out of Smith's office and be someone else's secretary. One model, which Westervelt secretly longed to examine at leisure, showed an entire city with its surrounding landscape on a distant planet. Westervelt tore his attention from the mementos and turned toward the group as Smith settled himself behind the desk. "This is no longer even approximately funny," said the department head. "I've had a few calls put through. Do you know how little we're going to have to work with?" "I gather that it is not very much," said Parrish calmly. "There are less than 50 Terrans on that whole planet," declared Smith, running the fingers of one hand through his already untidy hair. "The nearest colony or friendly spaceport from which we could have equipment sent in is 20-odd light years away." "Well, that could be done," said Leidman mildly. "Oh, of course it could be done," admitted Smith. "But how long do we have to fool around? We don't know under what conditions Harris is being held." Parrish leaned forward to rest his elbows on Smith's desk. "We can deduce some of them pretty well," he suggested. "In the first place, if he got out several messages, which we'll have to assume he did, they must have found some means of providing him with air. He could have lived a while on the air in this submarine he built," said Leidman. "Yes, but in that case he would have used its radio for communication. We have to assume that they pried him out somehow, no?" The others nodded. "He wouldn't last too long in a spacesuit even if they pumped in air under pressure," said Leidman judiciously. "So they must have built some kind of structure to house him, if only a big tank," said Parrish. Westervelt stirred, then closed his mouth rather than interrupt. Smith, however, had seen the motion and looked up. "Speak up, Willie," he invited. "It won't sound any sillier than anything else that's been said in this room." I was wondering about these Tridentians," said Westervelt. "Does anybody know how they live? Do they have cities built on the sea bottom?" "If they have water jet vehicles, they certainly have the technical—" Smith stopped, as he saw Parrish lean back and roll his eyes toward the ceiling. "What now, Pete?" he demanded apprehensively. "I don't know why that didn't occur to me sooner," groaned Parrish. 100 to 1 they have a nomadic setup. It would be typical with an environment like that. This is worse than we thought. You mean, muttered Smith after a few moments of silence. How can we get a direction fix on a thought? Something like that, said Parrish. I suppose they have bases where they keep permanent manufacturing facilities, probably set up at points where they have access to minerals, unless they know how to extract what they need from the water itself. Nothing hard about that, agreed Smith. I'll have to send out a few more questions. Of course, they'll take the attitude that I should be doing something instead of asking about irrelevant subjects. We're used to that, smiled Parrish, showing his beautiful teeth. Westervelt wondered how broadly he would smile if it were his own responsibility. He had an idea that Parrish might be rather less than half as charming if he were running the operation and not getting much help from the others in solving the problem. He had to admit, however, that the man had a knack for spotting alien culture patterns. When he had asked his question about the cities, it was merely because he had half-pictured some Terran-style dome underwater and knew that that image was unlikely. Anyway, Parrish was going on, we should probably think of them as being free as birds to go where they like. Even before they developed machines, they probably migrated about their world by swimming. I gather that these other fish, I suppose we'll have to call them. Thinking fish, murmured Smith sadly. He ran his hand through his hair again. I suppose those things still do, besides other types we still haven't heard of, which would fill the place of Terran animals. So then, we'll have to look for temporary locations, and think in terms of a fast raid rather than a careful penetration. If we could find them, there must be some way we could armor a few spacesuits against pressure and drop down on them, said Leidman. I think I can dig up a weapon or two that will work underwater in a way these clams never thought of. Maybe we could do better to have Swishy, the thinking fish, hypnotize them into bringing Harris back, said Westervelt. They looked at him thoughtfully, and he was horrified to see his joke being taken seriously. He squirmed in his chair by the window, wishing he had kept his mouth shut. I wonder, mused Smith, if they can actually exchange thoughts. They might have natural defenses, said Parrish tentatively. What could we bribe a fish with? Asked Leidman, but hopefully rather than derisively. Smith made another note, then drummed his fingers on his desktop. The four of them sat in silence. Westervelt hoped that the others were engaged in more productive thoughts than his own. It was nice to have their attention, and get the reputation of a bright young man who came up with suggestions. But when they decided upon some reasonable course of action, they might remember him for making a foolish remark. Willie, said Smith, coming to a decision, circulate around and ask the others if they can stick it out a couple of hours tonight. Maybe there's time to pry some useful information out of Trident, and at least get something started before we close down. If I know some guy out in space is working on it, I can sleep anyway. Westervelt left his place by the window and went into the outer office. He told Simonetta and Beryl. The latter acted less than thrilled. Westervelt wondered jealously what kind of date she had scheduled for the evening. He stopped at the window of the switchboard cubbyhole. "Oh, it's you, Willie!" exclaimed Pauline. "Yeah, you can turn on the projector again," he grinned. "What is it, a love movie?" Pauline edged a small tape projector out from under the side of her board. "It's homework, if you have to know," she told him. "That's right, you still go to college," Westervelt recalled. "Why don't you switch to alien psychology? Then you could qualify for office manager around here." "When do we have alien visitors here? Once in a ringed moon." "Who is to say which of the aliens?" said Westervelt. "There are days when I think I could feel more understanding to something with 12 tentacles and a tank of chlorine than to a lot of the mentalities that get loose right in this office. There's a crash program on for the evening, by the way, and Smitty wants the staff to hang on a while." A look of dismay flashed over Pauline's youthful features. "I know. You have class tonight," Westervelt deduced. "Chuck it all. Stay in the file room with Mr. Parrish and you'll learn twice as much." Pauline offered to throw the projector at him, but laughed. Westervelt told her that no one would miss her if she connected a few of the main office phones to outside lines and hooked up the communications room with Smith's desk. He left her wondering if she ought to stay anyhow, and headed for the hall. Halfway along to the communications room, he heard the elevator doors open and close. He stopped and looked back. Around the corner strolled one of the TV men, Joe Rosencrantz. Westervelt looked at his watch and realized that it was a shift change for the communications personnel, who kept touch with the universe 24 hours a day, in case someone somewhere makes a dumb mistake, like Harris, thought Westervelt. They overdo it a little, I think. I suppose it's the typical pride and joy of Terran technical culture to signal halfway across the galaxy to fix something that might have been cured beforehand when Harris was a little boy. I wonder what the psychologist should have done about me to keep me out of a place like this. "Hello, Willie," said Rosencrantz, catching up. "Going to the comm room?" Westervelt admitted as much, and gave the operator a brief outline of the afternoon's developments. Rosencrantz remained unperturbed. "Hope they don't get intoxicated with ingenuity and insist on sending messages all over," he grunted. "I was looking forward to a quiet night shift." They went in to tell Colburn, who took it well. He pointed out to Westervelt that he would in no case have been concerned with the overtime operation. When he was relieved, he was relieved. Period. I forget this crazy place the minute the elevator door closes behind me, he said, grinning, having handed over to Rosencrantz his log and a few unofficial comments about traffic he had heard during recent hours. There are some who wait till they hit the street, but I believe in a clean cut. I walk in, push main floor, and everything else goes blank. He went out the door, refusing to dignify their jeers by any defense, and made for the elevators. By the time he reached the corner of the hall, he had slipped into his topcoat. He pushed the button to call the elevator. When it arrived, Colburn stepped inside and rode down to the 95th floor. He switched to a public express elevator, which picked up several other people before becoming an express at the 75th floor. Lived through it again, he muttered to a man next to him as they reached the main floor. He joined the growing stream of office workers flowing through the lobby of the building, taking for granted the kaleidoscope play of decorative lights on the translucent ceiling. He noticed them when they suddenly went out. There was first silence, then a babble of voices until small emergency lights went on. Someone spoke of a fuse blowing. Colburn looked outside and saw no streetlights or illuminated signs. His first thought was power for his set upstairs. No, that's special, he told himself. But I'd better call and see if the elevators are working. End of Chapter 5. D-99 by H.B. Fyfe. Chapter 6. This LibriVox recording is in public domain. For a jail cell, the chamber was quite commodious. The walls were of bare stone, like most of the buildings in Greenhaven which Maria Ringstad had visited during her short period of sightseeing. She thought that it must have entailed a great deal of extra labor to provide such large rooms in a stone building, especially when the materials had to be quarried by relatively primitive means. On Greenhaven, everything had evidently been done the hard way. She had heard about that facet of the Greenie character before leaving the ship, and she now wished that she had listened more carefully. It was difficult to picture in her mind just how far away that spaceship was by this time. That had been the worst, the feeling of having been abandoned. Meanwhile, having turned up her nose at the sewing chores they had assigned to her, but having nothing else to occupy her, she sat on the edge of the austere wooden shelf that doubled as a bed and a bench. The Greenie guard standing in the doorway looked as if he had expected to find the sewing done. "Can't you understand, honey?" said Maria lightly. "You can cart that basket of rags away. I have no intention of sticking my fingers with those crude needles you people use." The Greenie was a short, sturdy young man, uniformed in the drabbest of dun-colored clothing. A shirt with a high, tight collar, starched like cardboard, held his chin at a dignified elevation. It also seemed to keep his eyes wide open, Maria thought, unless that was his naturally naive expression. "Did anyone ever tell you those hats would make good spittoons?" she asked. "It is forbidden to speak vainly of any correction official," said the young man stiffly. "Correction official?" echoed Maria. "Look, honey, don't kid with me. I bet you're just a janitor here. If I thought you were a real official, who might be cuddled into letting me out of this cage, I'd be a lot more friendly." She gave him an amiable grin. It was not returned. The Greenie stood gripping the thick edge of the blank wooden door until his knuckles whitened. He looked like a man who had just discovered a worm in his apple. Half a worm, in fact. "Now I may be pushing 35, said Maria, "but I know I don't look that bad. Actually, alongside your Greenie girls, I stack up pretty well, don't you think? For one thing, I'm shorter than you are. For another, I fill out my clothes, and don't look like a skinny old horse." "You are not dressed as an honest woman," the guard got out. Sitting on the edge of the wooden bunk, Maria crossed her knees, and thought he would choke. She tugged slightly at the short skirt that had attracted so many lowering stares when she had strolled down the main street of First Haven. She was used to being among men, but this poor soul was outside her experience. Maria Ringstad was aware of both her visual shortcomings and attractions. After a month here, her hair was beginning to grow in darker and less auburn. She was a trifle solid for her 5'4", but that came of having a durable frame. Her face was squarish, with a determined nose, and her hazel eyes looked green in some lights. On the other hand, she had a nice smile, and she had spent much time in places where few women went. She was used to being popular with the opposite sex, even in face of competition from members of her own. In the Greenie women, with their voluminous drab dresses and hangdog expressions devoid of the least makeup, she saw little competition. "Really," she said, "no one else would think of me as a criminal. I just tried to buy a picture in that little shop. Then the heavens fell in on me." "The heavens do not fall on Greenhaven," said the guard firmly. "Well, anyway, some very sour characters trumped up all sorts of charges against me, and here I am. But I didn't do anything." "The attempt is equal to the deed." Maria shook her head and sighed. She stood up and took a few steps toward him. You must keep your place, ordered the young man, with an undercurrent of panic in his tone. I have not come to debate justice with you. You have sinned, and you have been sentenced. I bet he'd faint if I threw my arms around him, thought Maria. But what was the sin, honey? She demanded. You'd think I'd written a bad article about Greenhaven for my syndicate. Honestly, I didn't even have time to see the place. The young man released the edge of the door, but still looked worried. Greenhaven was founded by colonists who sought liberty and were willing to create a haven for it by the sweat of their brows, he informed her. Conditions were inhospitable. There were plagues to test their faith, an ungainly beast to test their courage. What has been built here has been built by a great communal struggle, and it is not to be hazarded by the sinful attitudes of old Terra. And you should have paid the listed price. But he wouldn't sell me one at that price when I offered it. Then he did not have one. You attempted to bribe him. Well, it was just a friendly offer, said Maria, straightening her skirt. It didn't amount to anything. On the contrary, it amounted to bribery, immorality, and economic subversion. Procedures such as purchases and merchandising must be strictly regulated for the good of the community. We cannot permit chaos to intrude upon the peace of Greenhaven. You know, honey, she remarked, studying him with her head cocked to one side, you talk like a book, a very old book. The guard rolled his eyes toward the hall. He relaxed for the first time, in order to lean back and listen to something in the corridor. I must caution you to cease addressing me as honey, he said in a lower voice. I hear the steps of my superior. Maria laughed, a silvery ripple that made the young man grit his teeth. Maybe he's jealous, she suggested. Or bored. What do you fellows have to do, anyway, except go around handing out cell work and picking it up? There is no place on Greenhaven for idle hands, said the young man, eyeing the untouched sewing with disapproval. Isn't there any excitement? How often does someone try to escape? It is forbidden to escape, said the guard soberly. He looked as if he wished that he himself could escape. Heavy steps halted outside the door of the cell to signal the arrival of the chief warden. The latter turned a severely inquiring stare upon the young man, who hastily stepped aside to admit his chief. Have you been conversing with the prisoner? Asked the older man. He was clad in a similar uniform, with, perhaps, a slightly higher collar. His dark-browed features reflected greater age and asceticism. Otherwise, Maria thought ruthfully, there was little to choose between them. He seemed to have a chilling effect upon the guard. Only in the line of duty, sir, the young man responded. The warden spotted the basket of undone work. He frowned. This should have been attended to long ago, he said. What excuse can there be? Maria planted both hands on her hips. Plenty, she announced. In the first place, you have no right to hold a Terran citizen in a hole like this. In the second, that ridiculous 5-year sentence is going to be appealed and canceled as soon as the Terran Council gets things moving. That is at least doubtful, retorted the warden, favoring her with a wintry smile which raised the corners of his mouth 1/8 of an inch. Meanwhile, there are methods we can use to enforce obedience. Would you rather I summon some of the women of the staff? I'd rather you'd explain to me what was so awful about trying to buy a picture of the city in that little shop. If they weren't for tourists to buy, why did they have them? Such nonsensical objects are provided for tourists and others who must from time to time be admitted to Greenhaven. That does not excuse flouting our laws and seeking to cause dissatisfaction through the example of bribery. The city of First Haven has been wrung from the wilderness, but the struggle to complete our building of the colony must not be hindered or subverted. It is necessary— "Aw, hell! You talk like a book, too!" exclaimed Maria. The two men stared at her, silent, wide-eyed, utterly shocked at this open evidence of dementia. "The price list is sacred to you," she snapped, "but it's all right to put that junk on sale to clip the tourists, isn't it? Why doesn't that strike you as being immoral? They're no good, but their money is that it?" She turned and stalked back to the shelf bed, where she sat down and deliberately crossed her legs. "You will not be required further," the warden told the young man. "See that you spread not the plague by repeating any of this Jezebel's loose talk." The guard left hurriedly. Maria discovered the warden gaping at her knees and defiantly tossed her head. "You never see a leg before?" she demanded. "Or are all you greenie girls bow-legged? Is that why they wear those horrible Mother Hubbards?" She gave her skirt a malicious twitch, revealing a few more inches of firm thigh. The warden began to turn red. He muttered something that actually sounded closer to a prayer than a curse, and then turned his eyes away. "I hope those in authority will yield to the importunities of your depraved fellow who calls himself the Terran Council, and sullies the clean air of Greenhaven by his very— I hope they deport you." "Oh, honey, could you arrange it?" cried Maria, leaping up and advancing on him. She grabbed him just above the elbows, and he broke her hold by sweeping both hands upward and outward. This offered Maria the opportunity to take a double grip under his belt. When he lowered his hands to free himself, she threw both arms about his neck. "I knew someone could fix things up," she exclaimed. "You're going to let me out of here until they decide what ship to put me on, aren't you?" The warden's expression was horror-stricken. With a heavy effort, he got both hands against her and shoved. Maria staggered back all the way to the bunk. The warden, apparently not quite sure what he had done, looked down at his hands. He turned them palm up. Then, as his gaze met Maria's, made as if to thrust them behind his back. "Relax, honey," she said. "You were a little high. I don't imagine you have any laws here against shoving a lady on her can, as long as you're careful where you shove." "May the Founders protect me from a forward woman," breathed the warden. "Will you be still and listen to me, Jezebel, or would you continue ignorant of the news I brought?" "What news?" "I'm instructed to inform you that you have an official visitor. Do you wish to see him?" Maria shoved herself away from the edge of the bunk and assumed a dignified stance. She tugged her clothing into order. "I should be most honored to receive this visitor," she said in her best imitation of greeny formality. "I deeply appreciate your announcing his presence. At last." The warden glared at her, finding no words worthy of the state of his blood pressure. He stepped back and slammed the heavy door shut. It muffled somewhat his departing footsteps. "I'm out," yipped Maria. She did a little jig, ran to the door to press an ear against it, and turned to survey the cell with the fingers of one hand beating a light tattoo against her lips. She crossed to the bunk. From beneath it she dragged the small overnight bag she had succeeded in obtaining from the ship before it had left for the next planet. She began to go about the room, collecting the few odds and ends she possessed and packing them. She was fingering the bristles of her toothbrush for dampness when she heard returning footsteps. "The hell with brushing my hair," she thought. "I'll go as is." She threw the toothbrush into the bag, tossed her hairbrush on top, and snapped the catch. She considered herself ready. The door opened and the warden ushered another man into the cell. Maria felt a sudden chill. The newcomer was a greenie. She looked over his shoulder, hoping for a glimpse of the Terran Council. But there were just the two greenies facing her. The stranger was nearer in age to the young guard than to the warden. On the other hand, the severity of his expression was a challenge to the older man. The uniform was about the same. "My name is John Willard," he announced flatly. He reached into an inner pocket to produce a fold of papers. At the edge of one, Maria caught sight of what she guessed to be an official seal. Willard opened the papers and turned to the warden. "You identify the prisoner before us as one Maria Ringstad, native of Terra." "I do," said the warden righteously. "You will please sign this statement to that effect." There was silence in the cell as the warden held the document against the door to scribble his signature. Maria watched in growing chagrin. Willard folded the statement of identification, returned it to his pocket, and faced her. "Maria Ringstad," he said, "I am to inform you that your appeal has been denied. You will accompany me to the corrective farm number 5, where I will deliver you to the authorities who will supervise the serving of your sentence." Maria dropped her bag. "What? You're lying. Let me see those phony papers. This is some sort of—" Willard let her have the back of his left hand across the face. Maria never saw it until she was falling. She sat down with a thump, her legs stretched out straight before her. Unbelievingly, she watched Willard sign a copy of his order for the warden. The latter examined it with satisfaction before tucking it away. They turned to look down at her, and Willard announced that he was ready to leave. He seemed to think that a good way to forestall an argument was to get her moving as quickly as possible. He yanked on one elbow. The warden pulled on the other, and Maria headed for the door at a smart trot, wondering how she had risen. "My bag!" she protested. "I have it," said Willard. "Turn left for the stairs," said the warden. "I'm not going," she yelled. "Yes, you are," said Willard. "Yes, you are," echoed the warden. They reached the head of the stairs where the warden released his grip. Willard shoved her forward and the two of them descended with a breakneck lack of balance. At the bottom, they paused for the warden to catch up. Maria seized the chance to kick Willard in the shin. He turned white, but urged her on as the warden led the way through a barred door into an open courtyard. They crossed the courtyard by fits and starts, with Maria expressing her opinion in words she had never before uttered. The meaning of certain of them still eluded her, but Willard seemed to understand the general drift. The warden spoke to a guard, ordering him to open the main gate. Willard boosted her through with a knee in the behind. The massive portal swung to with a thud, leaving them out in the street. "I'll be damned if I go to any prison farm," Maria shouted in his ear. "I demand to see the Terran Council. This is an outrage." Willard glared at a passing greenie who seemed disposed to look on. He tightened his grip on Maria's arm, the better to tow her 20 feet down the street away from the gate. There, he backed her roughly against the blank granite wall. "If you don't shut your face," he growled between set teeth, "I'll really belt you one." Maria gasped in a breath and looked at him. It was easy, since he had thrust his face within a few inches of hers. Little droplets of perspiration stood out on his forehead. He looks scared. End of chapter 6.